One of the best ways for a storyteller to showcase the difference between their protagonist and their antagonist is to show how each of the pair view the same thing. Like how Harry Potter welcomes death as a friend in order to protect his allies, while Voldemort fears death so much that he's willing to tear apart his own soul by murdering others. The things that each are willing to sacrifice in the face of death are diametrically opposed to the other, thus showing why they are at odds with one another. It's also part of the reason why so many villains in the Marvel Cinematic Universe are just palette-swapped versions of the hero. The cinematographers attempt to call out the differences between the hero and the villain by having almost everything other than those philosophical differences be the same. It's how each of them uses the same power that allows us to see why one is the hero and the other is the villain. In the passage for this sermon, 2 Samuel chapter 15, in our series entitled A Song of Failures and Hope, we see a real-life biblical example of this. Actually, a few examples, but primarily one. Specifically, the thing that the pair view from opposing sides is the role of king over Israel. However, for means of application, we'll broaden it out to being a person God calls for his own purposes. What are the hallmarks of a servant of God? After the past couple of chapters from 2 Samuel, some people might be wondering who the hero is actually going to be in this story. The general feeling of those recent sermons has been like trying to find a truly heroic person in a grim, dark fantasy story. Even the protagonists have been a dark shade of gray recently. And it's true that David, whose story arc we've been following for quite some time now, has not been the most chivalrous of characters lately. Ever since the adultery with Bathsheba and the conspiratorial murder of Uriah back in chapter 11, David's proven that every focused character in the story arcs of the book of Samuel have gone from rising hope to fallen failure. Even with the true repentance for his sins, shown in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and Psalm 51, there's still been a dark cloud hanging over David. His bad parenting, shown in chapter 13, and his giving in to less than wise counsel in the previous chapter. But here in chapter 15, we'll catch a glimpse of that old version of David, the one who'd stood up to the giant epitome of human evil and declared, "How dare you defy Yahweh?" Though he still has the stain of failure upon him, David shows the hallmarks of a godly servant in this chapter. And his son Absalom proves himself a capable antagonist who seeks his father's role without having his father's faith, thus proving that rebellion, not disbelief, is the opposite of faith. And this rebellion began with actions that remind us very much of modern politicians. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 to 6. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses, and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land! Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Verse 1 begins with "after this." After all of the previous events, after the rape of Absalom's sister Tamar, and the 2 years of plotting to kill his brother Amnon for it, after the 3 years in exile, and after his return to Jerusalem and the more than 2 years that it took to be accepted back into David's presence, after all of that, Absalom continues his scheming ways, and eyes the throne that his father sits upon, the throne that would give him the power to perform what he saw as justice, which is more vengeance through conspiratorial planning than actual godly righteousness. Absalom's scheme first seeks to make everyone else see him in a position of power. Chariots were a rare thing in Israel. Typically, only people of high power would drive them, and such individuals would have runners in front of them announce the presence of this high official. We see that Absalom commanded 50 of such hype men. That's a huge entourage, all praising his name. Whenever Absalom was in the vicinity, no one doubted his importance. It's not like this grandstanding was new to him. Remember, in the last chapter, we saw that Absalom's yearly haircut had some spectacle to it. He just amped up that idea, cranked it to 11, as we've seen as his specialty. But his schemes don't end with this grandstanding. No, he continues to politicking, basically campaigning for his right to rule, a smear campaign against his opposition. Absalom would rise early in the morning and sit at the gate of the city, in the place where the elders and leaders of the city would sit to usually bestow wisdom. And he would call out to any and every person who came to Jerusalem for the purpose of bringing their case to King David. The prince proved his acting chops as he sighed in false sympathy and told the supplicant, I see that you are in the right, my friend. But alas, the king fails in his duty to his people. There are none to hear your case, none to vindicate you from your plight. If only I could be placed in charge, then I would hear your case myself, and see that you gained all that you desire." It didn't matter whether or not the person was in the right. Absalom could promise anything, because all he was interested in was getting the throne, not helping the people who'd have to use and abuse to gain that power. All he needed was for them to believe that he'd be there for him. He didn't need to actually keep his campaign promises. And he coupled this promise with false humility. When the supplicant in front of him tried to bow in thankfulness, Absalom would do his best Aragorn impression, saying, "My friend, you bow to no man." He'd then embrace them like a close friend. And I'm sure that more than once after the supplicant went on their way, he'd roll his eyes while swiping the dirt and dust from his otherwise pristine garments. Can't believe they bought that one. Thus, as is recorded at the end of verse 6, Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. We understand that idiom well. It means to deceive. These actions of Absalom are labeled as bad and sinful. They're not the actions of a godly servant of Yahweh. Grandstanding and politicking and false humility are the tools of the selfishly sinful, useful only for those seeking to promote themselves. Which is exactly what Absalom's endgame is. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 7 to 12. "And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, 'Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur in Aram, saying, If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord.' The king said to him, 'Go in peace.' So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron.' With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests. And they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city in Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. After 4 more years of grandstanding, politicking, and false humility, a total of 6 years since he'd been returned to Jerusalem, and 11 years since the events of chapter 13. After all this time, the prince is ready to be king. Just a few last pieces needed to be moved on the board. For one, he felt like he needed to go to Hebron. If you remember, this is the city where David himself had first been announced as king over Judah, his first step toward the role of king over the whole nation. And so Absalom figured, like father, like son. He'd copied dear old dad by having the people of Hebron be the first to inaugurate him as king. And that city being his place of birth didn't hurt either. But the prince required an excuse to head to the Judean city, so he decided upon a fictitious story about a vow that he'd made to God back when he was in exile. He'd been lying about promises to others for years, so one more false vow didn't make a difference to him. It's a little late, in my opinion, after 6 years in Jerusalem to go pay a vow for the return to that city, but I guess he'd hide it with the idea of, "Oh yeah, I forgot until recently." As if that were something a person would be able to do with a vow to the God of Israel. And that's despite the fact that the Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem. So why Absalom would need to go to Hebron in order to pay a vow to God would raise even more questions to me. But David didn't think anything about it, and so he gave his blessing to his son, who was heading off to begin a coup. On his way to Hebron, Absalom maneuvered a few secret messengers, some spies, to prime the people to accept this transfer of power. They'd be the first to shout, "Long live King Absalom!" And others would easily follow the crowd. All you need is one person to kick off the festivities. Others will follow later. However, Absalom's 200-person entourage were not aware of his scheming. They went with him totally innocent of the conspiracy, some merely wanting to protect the prince on this short journey to Hebron, and others possibly handpicked for political reasons, which is exactly why Absalom invited Ahithophel. We might not understand the gravitas of Ahithophel being invited along, but people during David's day would understand at least part of the reason why this Absalom and Ahithophel alliance was a big deal. Ahithophel was a grand strategist. His most foolish words would put the wisest words of others to shame. He didn't have the level of wisdom that Solomon would eventually gain, but Ahithophel's wisdom would not be considered that far off. David had long utilized Ahithophel for his counsel. But you might be asking, if Ahithophel was such a quality advisor, why was he in his town of Gilo instead of Jerusalem with the king? And this is where we get to the gasp-inducing record scratch. But only if we've been following the story of Samuel along with full knowledge of all of the characters involved. We will see when we get to 2 Samuel chapter 23, a list of David's mighty men, his special forces units, And in verse 34 of that chapter, we'll see a man by the name of Eliam, who is the son of Ahithophel of Gilo. And some of us might have had a ping of remembrance about someone named Eliam, who was a mighty man of David's Special Forces units. We've heard it before somewhere, haven't we? Yeah, we have, because we've heard his name mentioned back in chapter 11 as the father of Bathsheba. Did the music just dramatically pause for you now? This wise counselor Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. Do you understand now why he might not want to be in Jerusalem with David anymore? Do you understand why Absalom, whose sister had been on the receiving end of abused power, might want to have Ahithophel as his advisor? Who better to have on your side advising you than one of the wisest men in the land, who also happens to have a reason to dislike your opponent? Ahithophel was Absalom's big gun, and the last piece required to be placed on the board before the coup happened. But while Absalom plotted to play king, David proved his place as king, his place as servant of Yahweh, who was humble, wise, and full of covenant faithfulness, which he proved by putting others ahead of his role as king. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 13 to 23. And a messenger came to David, saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." Then David said to all the servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, let us flee, or there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly, and bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." And the king's servants said to the king, "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides." So the king went out, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out, and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house. And all his servants passed by him, and all the Kerethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath, passed on before the king. Then the king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner and an exile from your home. You came only yesterday, and shall I today make you wander about with us, since I know not where I go? Go back and take your brothers with you, and may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you." But Ittai answered the king, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." And David said to Ittai, "Go then, pass on." So Ittai the Gittite passed on with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. And all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness. One of the king's messengers came back to David, explaining that Absalom's coup had happened. And David moves around like someone who'd planned for this long ago. He grabs his to-go bag and rallies the troops to follow him on the run. He might be a little older than he was before, but this would not be the first time that David had been on the run. But I want us to notice that while David had long been promised the role of king, and had fallen into comfort with it back in chapter 11, now he shows that he has learned to hold on to the role with loosened hands. His first thought wasn't, "But I'm the king, so let's dig in our heels and fight to the last man." No, that wasn't his way. With David, there was not going to be any version of House of the Dragon, with the greens versus the blacks. This wasn't going to happen. No, David realized that Absalom would march on Jerusalem and finish off what he'd started back when the prince had slain Amnon his brother. The other sons of David might have gotten away years ago, but there would be no reprieve from death for them this time. But even more than that, David placed the needs of the people of Jerusalem above his place as king. Rather than lose hundreds or thousands of residents in a lengthy siege, David said that he and any who desired to follow him would leave the city, and leave the doors wide open. Absalom could walk in without any bloodshed. David's move wasn't surrender. Rather, it was a calculated move to reduce the death toll for this coup. All it cost was the king leaving his capital, holding his role in the nation with loose hands. And the servants of David, along with his household, all said that they would follow their king. The only members that he left behind were 10 concubines, political marriages of alliance. The passage doesn't say, but likely these 10 women were those from alliances with people who now followed Absalom. It would at least make sense why he chose those 10. Regardless, we see David make another kingly choice in verse 17, as he puts others ahead of himself again. He'd led a parade of royalty, advisors, servants, and mercenaries all the way to the edge of the city. But to make sure that he leaves no Kevin McAllister home alone, David waves the others past this last barrier of the city. He counts his wives and their children, probably calls orders out to the mighty men currently with him, speaks quick words of encouragement to the children of his dearest servants. And even the foreign mercenaries who had allied with him joined up. They hadn't joined the throne of Israel, but joined the great military leader David. So they followed right along with him. And here, the narrative slows down to showcase an interesting conversation between David and Ittai the Gittite. Remember that a Gittite was a person from Gath, a Philistine, someone who was a member of the nation that had long been the epitome of human evil in the book of Samuel, the perennial enemy of God's people in the book. But when David sees this man Ittai and his mercenary band, with their wives and young children along as well, David tells him, "Go back, Ittai. You didn't sign up for this. You've only recently joined us. I have no right to ask of you and your children to follow along in these harsh days ahead. Go back. I am sure that Absalom would appreciate the troops." David's not expecting this newest band of mercenaries to follow him. But this man who belongs to the Philistine people, the Philistines, the epitome of human evil in the book of Samuel, this Philistine shows more loyalty to David than the king's own son does. The prince rebels against his own father, while the man from the people of the enemy stands faithful to the king. We find both enemies and friends in the strangest of places, but it's only those who rebel against the ways of God who are proven to be the actual enemy, and those who humbly bow to God's chosen king prove themselves to be worthy of our friendship. And to David, I'm sure this interaction held a special reminder from God about faithfulness. Think about this. This is a story where an Israelite tells someone not from the people of Israel to go back. But the non-Israelite says, "No, I will go where you go. Where you die, there I will be buried. Your God shall be my God, and your people my people." Does this sound familiar to anyone else? Those knowledgeable of the story of Ruth might recognize that I imported some of Ruth's words into Ittai's mouth. I did that because I'm sure that David, Ruth's great-grandson, heard echoes of those words at this moment. Ittai's faithfulness was a tiny hint of the covenant faithfulness of God, the faithfulness that he shows to his chosen king. David might have invoked Yahweh's blessing of steadfast love and covenant faithfulness when he told Ittai to go back, but the God of Israel showed that very same faithfulness right back to David, through the mouth of a Philistine. I can't help but see David smile for the first time in a long time. In the middle of this familial drama, a reminder of his family's faithfulness shines through. But this moment of joy is cut short as the parade of exiles flee the city. The Israelites from nearby towns witness an exodus of David's family from the capital. To them, this is the end of the world. The king sent to exile, their great hero forced away from his throne. Yet this was not the first time that God had turned a seemingly sure defeat into a great victory. That God has used his humble servant to bring down the machinations of evil's rebellion many times, before and since. And that humility of David to submit to the covenant faithfulness of God is proven once more, as he places his possible return back to Jerusalem squarely into Yahweh's hands. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 24 to 30. And Abiathar came up, and behold, Zadok came also with all the Levites, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God until the people had all passed out of the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Carry the ark of God back to the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back, and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, I have no more pleasure in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me what seems good to him." The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Are you not a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your 2 sons, Ahimaaz your son and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. See, I will await at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up, weeping as they went. The 2 leading priests brought some of their fellow priests and a host of Israelites, with the ark in tow. It was meant to be a symbol that the God of Israel was still with his chosen king, not the usurper Absalom. They figured that the God of Israel would once again move with his people in the wilderness. But David told them to return. Remember, this whole section began in chapter 11, when David rested comfortably in his own house, while the Ark of the Covenant dwelt in battle tents, with his people, like his people, among his people. But now, David sends the ark back to the tent placed in the city for it, while David goes out to dwell in tents in the wilderness. In a sense, the king is undoing the mistake that got him into all this trouble to begin with. As well, David proves the faithfulness that helped him on the way to the throne to begin with. He sets his role as king in the hands of Yahweh. If God should desire for David to remain the king, then God would bless David with sight of the ark and his home once again. But if this was the end of his time as king over Israel, if God said that he no longer found pleasure in David's reign, then it was God's right to change who ruled. Kingship had always been a gift from God. not something owned or seized by might. A true servant of God bows to his will, even if we should prefer something different. David's words even prove his humility. In verse 26 he says, "Behold, here I am, Hineni, the word of a servant of God. You have a mission, my lord? Witness me. Behold your servant. Look no further. I will do as you command. Here I am, Hineni." David placed his fate, his role as king over the nations, in the hands of God. And as a servant, he waited for God's call. He faithfully waited. We can even see David's faith in Psalm 3, which is written during his flight away from Absalom. In that psalm, he says that the Lord was a shield to him, his glory, the lifter of David's head. And at the very end of that psalm, he writes, "Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people." It would be by the grace of God alone that he regained his role as king over Israel. It was not the love of the people that a true servant of Yahweh seeks, but rather the covenant faithfulness of God. And though David placed his trust in God, he also knew that such faith included action of his own, wisdom in dealing with the enemies of God. And so, as he sent the priests and Levites back to Jerusalem, he also set up a spy network to keep tabs on the immediate actions of Absalom. Abiathar and Zadok would be spies in Absalom's court, and each of the priest's sons would be runners of that news, bringing the update to David as he waited at the edge of the wilderness, as he waited to understand what his next move should be. And up to the edge of the wilderness David headed, barefooted, head covered, and weeping, according to verse 30. And I don't think there is a preacher in existence who would not stop at this mention of weeping upon the Mount of Olives just outside of Jerusalem, and refuse to tie it to Jesus, the Son of David, who on the night he was betrayed ascended the Mount of Olives, heading to the Garden of Gethsemane as he wept and awaited the salvation of God's humble people, even sweating great drops of blood. Like Father, like Son, in the way that it should be, both holding their power and right to rule with loose hands, serving humbly, saying, "Here I am, not my will, but yours be done," refusing to rebel against the plan of God, living in faith despite the harsh road ahead of them. Examples for us to follow as we seek to be godly servants of Yahweh. David humbly placed faith in the steadfast love of God and moved in wisdom. The hint of faithfulness from God reignited the flame in David and would be rewarded with even more of God's faithfulness used wisely by the king. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 31 to 37. "And it was told David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. While David was coming to the summit where God was worshipped, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him, with his coat torn and dirt on his head. And David said to him, If you go on with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so now I will be your servant. Then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. Are not Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there? So whatever you hear from the king's house, tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, their 2 sons are with them there, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send to me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, came to the city, just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. Word of that record-scratching moment hit David. Ahithophel was allied with Absalom. David immediately recognized the threat and sent a prayer to God. Turn Ahithophel's wisdom to foolishness. Make the words of his counsel fall to worthlessness, otherwise we are in trouble. And God's answer to that prayer appeared on the horizon almost immediately afterward. Another of David's counselors arrived, but this wasn't the chance to have competing counsel face off against each other. Rather, this was a chance for David to get a mole even closer into Absalom's court, while also being able to muddy the waters of wisdom. If Hushai could give counsel to Absalom that sounded good, but only fed into Absalom's selfish grasp, then the words of Ahithophel might fall on deaf ears. It was almost like God had planned it that way. Faithfulness rewarded. And the information pipeline had already been placed through the sons of Abiathar and Zadok. Even more, we see that God timed things perfectly so that a refreshed Hushai was ready in the open gates of Jerusalem to accept the newly crowned King Absalom to his capital. And the grandstanding politician swelled with pride as he stepped into the God-readied trap. But the rest of that story is for another time. For now, we see the rebellious usurper and the faithful servant, both looking at the role of king. The first, plotting, lying, reaching, grasping, taking, seizing, and abusing the lives of others, all for his own self-aggrandizing rise to power. And the second, waiting, praying, bowing, leading, loosely holding the role while thinking of others ahead of himself. The pair are opposed because they view the role of king from very different angles. Absalom saw the role in the same way that those outside of the people of God always see it. Power for the sake of using it as they see fit. Rebelling against any who stand in their way. Selfishness with as few limits as possible. But the one who stands heroically is the one who bows faithfully. David saw the role for what it was, a gift from Yahweh, something given and taking according to his will alone. Power for the sake of doing God's will among God's people. Humility in the face of the limitless God. Humility, wisdom, and covenant faithfulness are the hallmarks of a godly servant, not grandstanding, politicking, and false humility. Let us never use any of the ways of Absalom, the ways of this world, to grasp for power. Never use others to make ourselves look better. Never cut off true justice so that we can virtue signal. Never use false faithfulness as a cover for our plotted rebellion. Those are villainous ways, not the ways of a servant of God. No, the servant of the Lord humbly says, "Here I am. Use me as you see fit, Lord." The servant wisely acts in line with what they know the ways of God to be, and the servant remains faithful to the covenant faithfulness of God. It is how we view the commands and ways of God that proves which side we are on, rebel or faithful follower, palette-swapped villain or heroic servant.